We have come to Lesson 38's diagram for the little book of Judith. We have seen two other books in the Old Testament named for women, Ruth and Esther, and Judith completes the triumvirate. Ruth, well, what was the problem? That she, by her submitted spirit, was instrumental in God's way of dealing with the authority problem. The authority problem in the time of Ruth was anarchy, everyone doing what he thought he wanted to do. Sounds like our own times. And how does that ever be corrected, that people would come under rightful authority? Ruth was the first little step. She followed her mother-in-law back into Israel, even though she was an unwanted alien, and God provided her a husband to whom she was submissive. Her very spirit was always one of obedience, wanting only the God of the Israelites as her God. And there she became the mother of a child who would be the forebearer, the grandfather of King David, who inherited her spirit, her loving, obedient spirit toward God. Well, granted, he was a sinner, but still he had a heart of obedience, which we will say came into the story with Ruth. Then we saw how Esther, during the time of the Persians, was used by God to save the Jews. It is a fictionalized story that is at least partially based on history when we thought about Nehemiah. But Esther, even though there was a strong enemy who had completely captivated the king's thoughts and who had sent out an edict to destroy the Jews, her submissive spirit, if I die, I die, takes her to steps that save the people. So there was Esther with a rightful authority in her life, a strong authority, nevertheless one wrongly influenced by evil, finding the way to overcome evil in her obedience. So now we come to Judith. It's not really based on history. It is a fictionalized story, but it is called into being because of what's happening to the people, and we'll see that in a minute. But to put this in the rightful frame, look up there in the left-hand corner, and you'll see my favorite little diagram with a reminder that the second person of humans, the second person of humanity, the woman, has been the key since the Garden of Eden as to whether mankind will be obedient to God, loving toward God, accepting God's authority, or will go off on their own, claiming power and prestige for themselves, which is exactly the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So from the very beginning, even the Lord speaking to Eve, saying that it will be woman's seed who will overcome evil, is already setting the stage for these three women and their efforts, their belief, their faith that leads them to be instruments for God in bad times. So mankind has a second person, and we've looked that over very carefully for some time. And this story is a response to the wrong use of authority by that evil man that we read about in our last lesson, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and what he was threatening to do to the revealed faith that is symbolized down at the bottom by the temple in Jerusalem, which is the abode of God and pure worship. But we had Epiphanes, Antiochus Epiphanes, threatening to destroy that faith. We looked at it carefully in Maccabees. And we saw that the Maccabeans had to come up against this evil force. So this story then takes off with that as the background. And it's as the little box says, this is a fiction story meant to encourage and guide the people during the evil rule and Hellenization policy of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So when in the 3rd chapter this Nebuchadnezzar is demanding that he be worshipped, this is the threat that he, in the story, is making against the abode of true worship in Jerusalem. And the picture then shows you what the story is all about. Up there is a streaky, odd shape, and it stands for overwhelming power. It's Satan's pseudo-authority threatening Jerusalem. The goal of Nebuchadnezzar in the story, Holofernes is simply his chief general, is to gather this huge army and set out to destroy the worship of Jerusalem. So there is that mass up there gathering with great power. Then you have 2 little mountains. On both sides there's in through the center is a black line, and it goes all the way down through all those words. It's an arrow, and its intent is the temple in Jerusalem, which is the story of Judith. On these little mountains, there is one little village up there, Bethulia, totally weak, totally dependent on a spring at the bottom of the mountain. But this mass, this satanic mass up above of armies, its only way in the story to get to Jerusalem is between those 2 mountains, and therefore Bethulia is in a very strategic place. But what can it do? What can it do against this mass that is threatening? It's the only faith that is. How can that little place do anything about this massive force? Well, you know the story now, how Judith, a widow, a beautiful widow, but one who does not, we could almost say, not care about her beauty or her possessions or her wealth or anything, and lives in a little hut on top of her house in prayer and penance, and she's seeing what the elders of her village are all about. They're going to give God 5 days. We're going to tell God what to do in this terrible calamity that's about to happen. And she devises a plan, works it out to the details, goes to the elders, gets their blessing, also chastises them for their bad theology, and you know the rest of the story. Now, she has absolutely no power of her own, but she assumes the trappings of a woman, a verve, shall we say, a woman of a strong mind, because this is what will impress this great general, Holofernes. But her plan is carried, she has it down to the very small details. She knows exactly how she will proceed. However, she also knows that she's completely helpless and that only God can make the way. She can be prepared, but she cannot accomplish her goal. So the story goes on, and you have the horrendous picture in your mind of her carrying Holofernes' head in a bag back to Bethulia, where it's prominently displayed. The armies of Bethulia arouse themselves because Holofernes is dead, and down they go, and the consternation of the troops below are such that they all run away, and Jerusalem is saved. The poor of Yahweh, powerless in the ways of the world, a woman shows the way. How is it? Well, as we see, Judith simply means Jewess. She's a figure for Israel and the terrible things they're facing, how to overcome them. Well, there are some principles laid down in Judith about overcoming evil. Actually, as is on your diagram, it takes a heart condition. What is that heart condition? Submission to God, humility, obedience. Nothing that we run into every day. But that is the right heart condition for overcoming evil. It begins, of course, as this plan is devised, with trust in God. We must not force His hand, as those elders in Bethulia were apt to, by saying, we'll give him 5 days, and if he doesn't act, then we'll give up. We'll surrender. No. We don't force God's hand. We may have a plan, but we're totally dependent upon Him. So we don't run ahead of Him with our plan. We must have that obedience to maintain our prayer and penance, because we cannot trust in ourselves even if we have a very adequate plan. We can only trust that God has complete control. We may not be on the right track. We may be, well, as dear Esther had to come to, if I die, I die. That is in the base of our mind. If I die, I die. We trust in God's total control. On the other hand, we need to understand the enemy's mind. And certainly Judith does. She knows that they rely on power. They rely on their great strength. They don't rely on God. And understanding that, she knows that she can deceive him by playing on his pride, by playing on his arrogance. Actually, when you stop and think about it, Mary deceived Satan by choosing to be a young woman who would not marry and would not have children. In her cultural situation, that was an unheard of choice for a young woman. There was nothing prestigious or good about that for her future. She chose the most humble road that looked like nothing, and in that she overcame Satan, who doesn't understand such a stance, such a way of thinking. Not at all. It's opposite to him. He would have us all building a tower to Babel so that we could assault heaven. So you prayerfully make a plan understanding the enemy's mind, how he thinks. Then realizing again that only God can fulfill the plan. The next one, put aside fear and indecision and self-pity. We've got enough of that. Make careful preparation, and again, using the enemy's false ideas to deceive, look as though that's your idea too. You know it isn't. But that's the way you undermine the enemy's false premises. You adhere to God's command, never compromising. She didn't give up her dietary restrictions when she went down into that camp and was offered all kinds of foods that were not kosher. Never compromising the 10 Commandments in whatever you do. Strike decisively when God gives the opportunity. I don't expect anyone to take a sword and cut off anyone's head. However, there will be an opportunity where some kind of a decisive action can be made. And then, with the result, praise God alone for the victory. Does Judith carry on as though she's some great person? No, not at all. She goes back, we assume, to her widowhood, to her little hut on the top of her home, and she praises God alone for the victory. However, we don't stop there. We keep on until the enemy is routed, in whatever circumstance this plays out. So this is the third woman of the Old Testament, preparing us to meet the woman and showing us how, as children of God, we overcome the evil one.